The morning whistle pierced through the thick industrial haze that perpetually shrouded Pittsburgh in the spring of 1885. Smoke billowed from countless factory chimneys, creating a grey canopy over the sprawling city that had become the beating heart of American industry. The Pennsylvania Railroad's massive yards stretched across the riverfront like iron arteries, pumping the lifeblood of commerce through the nation's veins. Margaret O'Brien hurried along Liberty Avenue, her worn leather boots clicking against the cobblestones as she clutched a small cloth bundle containing her meagre lunch. At 19, she had already spent 3 years working at the Heinz pickle factory, her nimble fingers moving with practiced precision along the assembly lines. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely under a simple cotton cap, and her plain grey dress bore the permanent stains of vinegar and brine that marked her station in life. The city around her buzzed with the energy of progress. Horse-drawn carriages shared the streets with the occasional steam-powered vehicle, while telegraph wires crisscrossed overhead like a mechanical spiderweb connecting Pittsburgh to distant cities. The smell of coal smoke mixed with the aroma of fresh bread from German bakeries and the acrid scent of steel production that never ceased. As Margaret approached the factory gates, she noticed an unusual commotion near the railroad offices across the street. A crowd had gathered around several well-dressed gentlemen engaged in animated discussion. Even from a distance, she could recognize the imposing figure of Theodore Blackwood, the railroad magnate whose empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. His perfectly tailored black coat and silver-tipped walking cane marked him as clearly as any royal crown. Blackwood commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout the industrial corridor. At 42, he had built his fortune through shrewd business dealings and an iron will that brooked no opposition. His Pennsylvania Central Railroad had absorbed smaller lines with the efficiency of a steam engine consuming coal, making him one of the most powerful men in America. Margaret paused at the factory entrance, watching as a group of nervous-looking men in modest suits surrounded Blackwood. She recognized them as representatives from the smaller regional railroads that still maintained precarious independence in the face of the growing monopolies. Their anxious postures and fidgeting hands suggested this was no ordinary business meeting. The factory bell clanged again, more insistently this time, and Margaret reluctantly turned toward her workplace. The Heinz factory represented progress of a different sort than the railroads. Henry Heinz had built his business on the revolutionary concept of mass production and quality control, employing hundreds of workers in conditions that, while demanding, were considerably better than many of the steel mills and coal mines that dotted the region. Inside the factory, the familiar symphony of industrial production began. Conveyor belts creaked and groaned under the weight of glass jars, while steam-powered machines chopped, mixed, and processed vegetables with mechanical precision. The workers, mostly young women and immigrant men, took their positions with the disciplined efficiency that had made American manufacturing the envy of the world. Margaret's station was near a large window that overlooked the street, allowing her glimpses of the ongoing drama at the railroad offices. Throughout the morning, she watched as more men arrived in expensive carriages, their serious expressions and hurried movements suggesting deals of enormous consequence were being negotiated. The very air seemed charged with the electricity of impending change. During her brief lunch break, Margaret ventured closer to the railroad building. The crowd had grown larger, and she could hear fragments of conversation about mergers, stock transfers, and the consolidation of rail lines. The smaller railroad owners looked increasingly desperate, their faces pale with the realization that their livelihoods hung in the balance. As she stood among the onlookers, Margaret overheard 2 well-dressed men discussing the proposed deal. One mentioned astronomical sums of money, while the other spoke of the inevitable elimination of competition that would follow Blackwood's acquisition of the remaining independent lines. The conversation painted a picture of corporate power that seemed to Margaret both magnificent and terrifying in its scope. The afternoon brought an unexpected development that would change everything. As Margaret worked at her station, she noticed unusual activity around a small office building adjacent to the railroad headquarters. Men in dark suits moved with suspicious urgency, carrying leather portfolios and speaking in hushed, conspiratorial tones that carried even through the factory's din. Something about their behavior struck Margaret as wrong, though she could not articulate exactly what troubled her about the scene unfolding across the street. The following morning brought an unseasonable chill to Pittsburgh, with grey clouds hanging low over the industrial landscape, like a heavy woolen blanket. Margaret arrived at the factory earlier than usual, her curiosity about the previous day's events having kept her awake through much of the night. The gas street lamps still flickered along Liberty Avenue, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror her own restless thoughts. As she approached her workstation, Margaret noticed that the railroad offices across the street were already bustling with activity despite the early hour. Theodore Blackwood's distinctive black carriage stood prominently outside the main entrance, its brass fittings gleaming even in the dim morning light. The vehicle was drawn by a matched pair of bay horses whose breath created small clouds in the cool air, while a uniformed driver waited patiently on the high seat. The morning shift began with its usual mechanical rhythm, but Margaret found herself stealing glances toward the railroad building with increasing frequency. Something about the urgency of the previous day's activities had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. She had grown up in the working districts of Pittsburgh, where survival often depended on reading the subtle signs of trouble before it fully materialized. Around mid-morning, Margaret observed a curious development that made her pause in her work. A group of men she had never seen before emerged from the small office building adjacent to the railroad headquarters. Unlike the well-dressed businessmen who typically frequented such establishments, these individuals wore the rough clothing of laborers, yet their movements suggested a different purpose entirely. They carried themselves with the careful alertness of men engaged in activities they preferred to keep hidden. One of these men caught Margaret's particular attention. He was younger than the others, perhaps in his early 30s, with the lean build and calloused hands of someone accustomed to physical work. However, his eyes held an intelligence that seemed at odds with his humble appearance. As he walked past the factory windows, he glanced up briefly, and Margaret felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. During her lunch break, Margaret decided to venture closer to the railroad district. She told herself she was simply taking a different route to the small market where she usually purchased bread. But truthfully, her curiosity had overcome her natural caution. The streets around the railroad offices buzzed with unusual activity, as clerks hurried between buildings carrying important-looking documents and telegraph operators worked with visible urgency. As Margaret approached the main railroad building, she encountered Mrs. Catherine Walsh, an elderly Irish woman who cleaned the offices during the evening hours. Mrs. Walsh had worked in the building for nearly a decade and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the railroad's daily operations. She was sweeping the front steps with methodical precision, her sharp eyes missing nothing that occurred in her domain. The older woman recognized Margaret from the neighborhood and greeted her with a knowing nod. In hushed tones, Mrs. Walsh shared disturbing information she had overheard during her cleaning duties the previous evening. According to her account, representatives from several competing railroad companies had been meeting secretly with certain members of Blackwood's own organization, discussing arrangements that seemed designed to undermine the pending merger agreements. Mrs. Walsh described overhearing conversations about falsified documents, manipulated stock prices, and deliberate sabotage of railroad infrastructure. The cleaning woman's Irish accent thickened with emotion as she recounted details of a conspiracy that appeared to reach the highest levels of corporate power. She spoke of men plotting to destroy Theodore Blackwood's empire, not through honest competition, but through deliberate deception and fraud. The revelations struck Margaret with unexpected force. Despite her humble station in life, she possessed a strong moral compass inherited from her devoutly Catholic parents. The idea that powerful men would resort to such underhanded tactics to achieve their goals offended her sense of justice. Moreover, she understood intuitively that the consequences of such a conspiracy would extend far beyond the corporate boardrooms, potentially affecting thousands of workers whose livelihoods depended on the stability of the railroad industry. As she returned to the factory that afternoon, Margaret wrestled with the implications of what she had learned. The industrial world of 1885 was built on a foundation of trust and reputation, particularly in business dealings involving enormous sums of money. If Mrs. Walsh's information was accurate, Theodore Blackwood was walking unknowingly into a trap that could destroy not only his personal fortune but also the economic stability of the entire region. That afternoon brought additional confirmation of the conspiracy when Margaret observed the same group of suspicious men meeting again near the railroad offices. This time, however, they were joined by several well-dressed individuals who appeared to be providing them with specific instructions. The meeting lasted only a few minutes, but the furtive nature of their interaction left no doubt in Margaret's mind that illegal activities were being planned. As evening approached and the factory whistle signaled the end of another workday, Margaret faced a dilemma that would test both her courage and her principles. The gas lamps flickered to life along Liberty Avenue as Margaret O'Brien stood at the crossroads of her conscience. The evening air carried the familiar sounds of Pittsburgh's industrial heartbeat, the distant clang of steel hammers, the whistle of steam engines, and the rumble of loaded freight cars making their way through the sprawling rail yards. Yet tonight, these familiar sounds seemed charged with an ominous energy that made Margaret's hands tremble as she clutched her worn leather purse. She had spent the entire afternoon wrestling with the knowledge Mrs. Walsh had shared, turning over every detail, like a jeweler examining a precious stone for flaws. The conspiracy against Theodore Blackwood was real, and according to the cleaning woman's observations, the final phase would unfold the following morning when Blackwood was scheduled to sign the merger documents that would consolidate his control over the regional railroad network. Margaret understood the gravity of her situation with painful clarity. She was a factory girl from the Irish quarter of Pittsburgh, a young woman whose opinions carried no weight in the corridors of power where men in expensive suits made decisions affecting thousands of lives. The social distance between herself and Theodore Blackwood might as well have been measured in miles rather than city blocks. What business did she have interfering in affairs that were clearly beyond her station? Yet the moral imperative gnawed at her like a persistent ache. Her father, Patrick O'Brien, had died 3 years earlier in a mining accident that could have been prevented if the owners had invested in proper safety equipment instead of maximizing their profits. Her mother, before succumbing to tuberculosis, had taught Margaret that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of complicity. The lessons of her Catholic upbringing reinforced these principles, emphasizing the duty to protect the innocent and speak truth to power regardless of personal cost. As Margaret walked slowly through the darkening streets, she observed the evening routines of her neighbors with new eyes. The German baker closing his shop after a 14-hour day, the Italian family gathered around their dinner table visible through their tenement window, the group of Polish steelworkers heading home with coal dust still clinging to their clothes. All of these people depended on the stability of Pittsburgh's industrial economy, and that stability rested largely on the railroad network that Theodore Blackwood had spent decades building. The conspiracy against Blackwood was not simply a matter of corporate rivalry. If successful, it would likely result in chaos throughout the regional transportation system, affecting everything from food distribution to employment opportunities. The smaller businesses that depended on reliable rail service would suffer, and working families like her own would bear the ultimate cost of the powerful men's greed and ambition. Margaret's determination crystallized as she reached the boarding house where she rented a small room on the 3rd floor. The building housed primarily young women who worked in the various factories and mills throughout the city. Most were immigrants, or the daughters of immigrants, united by their shared struggle to build better lives in America's industrial heartland. Their conversations often centered on working conditions, wages, and the constant uncertainty that characterized their existence. That evening, Margaret found herself unable to concentrate on her usual routine of mending clothes and preparing for the following day's work. Instead, she sat by her small window overlooking the street, watching the patterns of light and shadow created by the gas lamps, and trying to formulate a plan that seemed both impossible and inevitable. The challenge before her was not simply moral, but practical. How could she, a young woman with no social connections or political influence, gain access to Theodore Blackwood? The railroad magnate was surrounded by layers of protection designed to shield him from the countless petitioners, job seekers, and business propositions that would otherwise consume his time. His offices were staffed with secretaries and assistants whose primary function was to filter out anyone deemed unworthy of his attention. Moreover, even if she somehow managed to reach Blackwood, why would he believe the warnings of an unknown factory worker? The information she possessed came from an Irish cleaning woman, whose credibility would be questioned by any reasonable businessman. Margaret had no documentation, no proof beyond second-hand observations and overheard conversations. Her warning would likely be dismissed as the imaginative fears of working-class women who failed to understand the complexities of high-level business negotiations. Yet as Margaret contemplated these obstacles, she remembered stories her grandmother had told about the old country, tales of ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. The Irish had survived centuries of oppression, partly because individuals had occasionally stepped forward to challenge injustice, even when success seemed impossible. The night deepened around Pittsburgh, but Margaret's resolve only grew stronger. She would find a way to warn Theodore Blackwood, regardless of the personal consequences. The conspiracy she had uncovered represented everything she had been taught to oppose: dishonesty, greed, and the willingness to destroy others for personal gain. As the clock in the boarding house parlor chimed midnight, Margaret finally fell into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with images of railroad tracks stretching endlessly into an uncertain future. Dawn broke over Pittsburgh with unusual clarity, the industrial haze temporarily lifted by overnight winds that had swept down from the Allegheny Mountains. Margaret O'Brien awoke before her alarm clock, her heart already racing with the anticipation of what lay ahead. She dressed with deliberate care, choosing her best dress, a deep blue cotton garment that her mother had sewn for her confirmation 3 years earlier. If she was going to confront one of the most powerful men in America, she would do so with whatever dignity her circumstances allowed. The morning routine at the Heinz factory proceeded normally, but Margaret's mind was entirely focused on the plan she had formulated during her restless night. She had decided that her only hope of reaching Theodore Blackwood lay in timing and audacity. According to Mrs. Walsh, the signing ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning, which meant Blackwood would arrive at his offices shortly after 9. Margaret would have to position herself strategically and hope that Providence would provide an opportunity. At 8:30, Margaret approached her floor supervisor, Mr. Heinrich Müller, a stern but fair German immigrant who had worked his way up from the factory floor through diligence and unwavering reliability. She explained that a family emergency required her immediate attention, a fabrication that made her uncomfortable, but seemed necessary under the circumstances. Mr. Müller studied her face for a moment, perhaps recognizing something in her expression that convinced him of her sincerity, then granted her permission to leave. Walking rapidly through the morning streets, Margaret felt the weight of her decision settle upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The familiar sights of her neighborhood seemed somehow different, as if she were viewing them for the last time. She understood intuitively that regardless of the outcome of her intervention, her life would never be quite the same. The simple certainty of her daily routine was about to be shattered by forces beyond her control. The railroad district buzzed with heightened activity as Margaret approached Blackwood's headquarters. Elegant carriages lined the street, their drivers engaged in quiet conversation while they waited for their wealthy passengers. Well-dressed men moved with purposeful urgency between buildings, their faces bearing the serious expressions of individuals involved in momentous affairs. The very air seemed electric with anticipation. Margaret positioned herself near the main entrance to the railroad building, attempting to appear casual while watching for Blackwood's arrival. Her heart pounded so forcefully that she feared it might be audible to passers-by. Several times she considered abandoning her plan and returning to the safety of her factory job, but each time her mother's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that courage was not the absence of fear, but action taken despite fear. At precisely 9:15, Theodore Blackwood's impressive carriage rounded the corner onto Liberty Avenue. The vehicle moved with the measured dignity befitting its owner's status, the matched bay horses stepping in perfect synchronization, while the driver maintained his elevated position with military bearing. Margaret watched as the carriage drew to a halt directly in front of the building, her mouth dry with nervousness. Blackwood emerged from the carriage with the confident ease of a man accustomed to command. He was taller than Margaret had expected, with broad shoulders and a bearing that spoke of both physical strength and intellectual authority. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly groomed, and his dark suit was tailored with a precision that probably cost more than Margaret earned in 6 months. Yet it was his eyes that captured her attention, sharp, intelligent, and utterly focused on the business at hand. As Blackwood approached the building entrance, Margaret stepped forward from her position near the street corner. Her legs felt unsteady, but her voice, when she spoke, carried a clarity that surprised her. She addressed him directly, using the formal courtesy her mother had taught her. Her words were simple, but urgent, requesting just a moment of his valuable time for a matter of critical importance. Blackwood paused, his eyebrows rising slightly in surprise. It was clearly unusual for him to be approached so directly on the street, particularly by a young woman whose appearance marked her as belonging to the working class. His initial expression suggested annoyance at the interruption, but something in Margaret's manner must have intrigued him because he did not immediately dismiss her or summon his security. Margaret seized the moment with desperate courage. She spoke rapidly but clearly, explaining that she had reason to believe he was about to be deceived by individuals he trusted. She mentioned the secret meetings she had observed, the suspicious activities around the adjacent building, and the conversations Mrs. Walsh had overheard about falsified documents and sabotage. Her words tumbled forth with passionate conviction, driven by the knowledge that she might never have another opportunity to deliver her warning. The railroad magnate listened with growing attention, his sharp eyes studying Margaret's face as if trying to assess her credibility. When she finished speaking, a moment of silence stretched between them that seemed to last forever. Around them, the morning business of the district continued, but Margaret felt as if the entire world had narrowed to this single conversation that might determine the fate of thousands. Finally, Blackwood spoke, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected vast enterprises and countless lives. Theodore Blackwood studied Margaret O'Brien's earnest face for what felt like an eternity, his calculating mind weighing the implications of her extraordinary warning. The morning sun cast long shadows across Liberty Avenue, as the railroad magnate found himself facing a decision that would define not only his business empire, but his character as a man. Around them, the industrial symphony of Pittsburgh continued its relentless rhythm, unaware that a moment of profound consequence was unfolding on the sidewalk. "Young woman," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the measured authority of a man who had built an empire through careful judgment, "what you're suggesting would require me to abandon agreements worth millions of dollars based on the observations of a factory worker and a cleaning lady." His words were not cruel, but they carried the weight of practical skepticism that had served him well in the ruthless world of 19th century business. Margaret felt her heart sink, but she refused to be dismissed so easily. Drawing upon reserves of courage she never knew she possessed, she met Blackwood's penetrating gaze directly. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand how this must sound to a man of your position, but I've lived in this neighborhood my entire life, and I know the difference between honest business and something darker. What I witnessed was not normal competition, it was conspiracy." Something in her unwavering conviction gave Blackwood pause. He had not survived 3 decades in the railroad industry without developing an instinct for reading people, and this young woman displayed none of the telltale signs of deception or personal agenda. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying her nervousness, but her eyes held a moral certainty that commanded respect, despite her humble circumstances. Blackwood glanced toward his office building, where representatives from multiple railroad companies were undoubtedly gathering for the signing ceremony that would reshape the transportation landscape of the Northeast. The contracts had been negotiated over months of careful deliberation, involving legal teams, financial advisors, and government officials. To abandon such arrangements based on the warning of an unknown factory girl seemed like madness. Yet, as Margaret continued to speak, providing specific details about times, locations, and individuals involved in the suspicious activities, Blackwood's business instincts began to stir. Several elements of her account aligned with minor inconsistencies he had noticed, but dismissed during the negotiation process. Questions about certain clauses in the contracts, unusual delays in document preparation, and the insistence of some parties on specific timing for the signing ceremony suddenly appeared in a new and troubling light. "Tell me exactly what this cleaning woman overheard," Blackwood commanded, his tone shifting from polite skepticism to genuine interest. Margaret recounted Mrs. Walsh's information with remarkable precision, describing conversations about falsified inspection reports, manipulated financial statements, and plans to trigger artificial emergencies that would force Blackwood's railroad into bankruptcy shortly after the merger was completed. As Margaret spoke, Blackwood's expression grew increasingly grave. His empire had been built on meticulous attention to detail and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his competitors' strategies. The conspiracy she described would explain several puzzling aspects of the current negotiations, including the unusual eagerness of certain parties to expedite the signing process and their willingness to accept terms that had initially seemed too generous. Blackwood made his decision with the same decisiveness that had characterized his entire career. Instead of proceeding directly to his office, he turned and walked toward the adjacent building where Margaret had observed the suspicious activities. His long strides forced her to hurry to keep pace, but she followed without hesitation, sensing that her warning had found its mark. The investigation that followed unfolded with dramatic swiftness. Blackwood's unexpected arrival at the building caught the conspirators completely off guard. Using his considerable influence and connections throughout the city, he quickly gained access to offices that revealed damning evidence of the plot against him. Documents discovered in hastily abandoned drawers confirmed Margaret's warnings in horrifying detail, revealing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of both government and business. The fraudulent contracts were elaborate forgeries, designed to transfer Blackwood's assets to Shell, companies controlled by his supposed partners. Railroad inspection reports had been falsified to hide critical infrastructure problems that would have caused catastrophic accidents, destroying public confidence in Blackwood's safety record. Financial statements had been manipulated to create the appearance of insurmountable debt that would force him into bankruptcy within months of signing the agreements. By noon, the conspiracy had completely unraveled. Several prominent businessmen were taken into custody by federal marshals, while others fled the city on the first available trains. The signing ceremony that was to have marked Blackwood's greatest triumph instead became the moment when his empire was saved from complete destruction. That afternoon, as news of the conspiracy spread throughout Pittsburgh's business district, Theodore Blackwood found himself facing a debt of gratitude he could never fully repay. Margaret O'Brien, the poor factory girl whose courage had saved his fortune, stood before him once again, this time in his private office rather than on a public street. Blackwood's response to Margaret's intervention stunned everyone who witnessed it. Rather than offering her a simple reward or token of appreciation, he made a decision that reflected both his gratitude and his recognition of her exceptional character. He offered her a position as his personal assistant, with responsibilities that would provide her not only with financial security, but also with opportunities to develop her obvious talents for observation and analysis. The transformation, in Margaret's circumstances, was immediate and profound, but perhaps more importantly, Blackwood's public acknowledgement of her role in exposing the conspiracy sent a powerful message throughout the industrial community about the value of moral courage, regardless of social station. The poor factory girl who had dared to warn a railroad magnate became a symbol of the principle that truth and justice could triumph over wealth and privilege when ordinary people found extraordinary courage.